The auction square was loud with the shuffle of boots and the clink of coins, a nasty, grinding sound that scraped at the soul. But I heard none of it. Not a single coin, not a single boot. All I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears the second the steward's fat hand clamped down on my shoulder and forced me to my knees. The stones were cold, unforgiving. A piece of silk, soft as a last breath, was pressed into my palm. I didn't need words to understand. It was a blindfold. "You will serve her unseen," the steward muttered, his breath smelling of sour wine and contempt. "No man is allowed to look at the princess. Remember that, if you want to keep your eyes at all." I'd been raised on ranch dust and the kind of open sky that makes you feel like you could touch God. I was a boy who dreamed of horses, not walls, of sunlight, not shadows. But dreams don't pay debts, and my uncles were heavy. So here I was, traded like a piece of livestock, dragged into a world of stone and secrets, where whispers were sharper than any blade. The whole crowd went quiet as the royal litter approached. Its curtains were so heavy with gold embroidery, they didn't even move in the breeze. The men carrying it moved with a kind of holy terror, like they were carrying a ghost. They said the princess was cursed. They said to meet her eyes was to invite your own ruin, to have your mind snap like a dry twig. So all the nobles, all the rich folks in their fine clothes, they all turned their heads away, but you could see them straining, trying to catch a glimpse without really looking. A dangerous game. When the litter finally stopped right in front of me, the air itself got thick. It was a strange mix, like breathing in both awe and pure, uncut fear. The steward didn't waste a second. He snatched the scarf from my hand and yanked it over my eyes, pulling the knot so tight a flash of white pain exploded behind my sockets. Daylight was gone. I was blind, and that's when I heard her. It wasn't the sound of a queen or a curse. It was the faint rustle of silks, and then a quiet intake of breath. It sounded less like majesty, and more like the loneliest sound I'd ever heard in my life. "He is strong enough," one of the guards announced, and some of the men around him laughed. The sound was ugly, mocking. I was just property to them, a strong back and a pair of arms. Strength was the only thing keeping me alive in their eyes. I wanted to scream my own name, to tell them I was more than muscle and bone, but pride was a luxury here, a dangerous one. So I swallowed it down, that burning coal of anger, and I stayed perfectly still. Then, a different voice cut through all of it. It was soft, as fragile as winter ice. "What is your name?" she asked. Nobody had prepared me for that. They told me about the rules, the blindfold, the curse. Nobody said she might speak, especially not to me, the dirt-caked ranch hand kneeling in the filth. The steward hissed at me, a snake-like sound right by my ear. "Be silent! Remember the law!" But her question just hung there in the air, hot and shimmering. My lips trembled. Every part of me, every inch of the boy who used to scream at the sky on the back of a horse, wanted to answer her, but I said nothing. The blindfold was a black cage locked onto my skull, but I could feel her presence. I felt her lean closer, a strange warmth, a current of curiosity that had no place in this cold, dead ceremony. Then, so low that only I could possibly hear it, she whispered 5 words that broke the world in two. "Lift your eyes just once." My heart didn't just beat, it staggered. It tripped over itself inside my ribs. In that one, single, solitary moment, I knew. This wasn't a myth. This wasn't a curse. This was a woman, a girl, locked in a cage of her own, and she was begging me not to let her be invisible. The blindfold suddenly felt like it was on fire. The cheap silk burned against my skin, not because of the sun, but because her words had lit a match inside my soul, a fire hotter than any Texas sun I'd ever worked beneath. "Lift your eyes just once." The guards stood so close I could smell the leather of their boots. The steward's warning hiss was still rattling in my ear like a cornered snake, but her whisper was a roar that drowned out everything else. My gut twisted with fear. What if the stories were true? What if seeing her face meant losing my mind, my life, the very last piece of myself I had left? I wanted to obey her. I wanted to be the one person who wasn't afraid, but fear is a cold, heavy thing. I clenched my fists until my knuckles were white bone, and I kept my head bowed. But inside, I was already breaking. They didn't give me a choice. Hands grabbed my arms and hauled me to my feet. They led me stumbling through the crowd, the blindfold still cinched tight until the hot sun was replaced by the cool shade of massive stone arches. The sounds of the city died away, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a blanket. The air changed too. The smell of dust and sweat was gone, and in its place was incense and roses. It was a cloying, suffocating scent, the smell of a beautiful prison. They pushed me to my knees again, this time on marble so polished I could feel the chill of it through my trousers. I heard chains rattling somewhere nearby, and I realized with a jolt this wasn't just a palace. It was a cage made of rules and gold. The guards left. The heavy doors boomed shut, and the silence stretched until it felt like it was about to snap. Then I heard it again. Her footsteps, so soft on the marble, but each one landed like a hammer blow against my heart. She was coming closer. My chest rose and fell way too fast, like I'd just run a mile even though I hadn't moved an inch. "You may speak now," she said. Her voice was still trembling, like a person who had never been given the right to give a command before. I had to swallow twice before I could find my own voice. I told her my name. Just my name. The sound of it, spoken aloud in that vast, empty chamber, seemed to startle her, as if no one had ever dared to answer her so directly. She repeated it, so quietly, like she was tasting the shape of it, and something inside my chest settled. For the first time since I left the ranch, I felt solid. I wanted to tell her I wasn't afraid of some stupid curse, but the courage I thought I had got snagged on the thick silence of the room. Then, in a rush of words, she said something no princess should ever say to a servant she just met. I was never asked if I wanted this life. My pulse hammered against my veins. In the total darkness of my blindfold, I saw her more clearly than I could have with my own eyes. I saw her loneliness, a princess hidden from the entire world, forbidden from even being looked at. Her beauty wasn't a gift. It was a set of chains, far heavier and tighter than any my uncle's debts could forge for me. My throat felt tight, but I managed to scrape out the words. "Then let me be the first to see you," I said. It was barely a breath, but it was the truest thing I'd ever said. She gasped, a sharp, shocked sound, as if the marble floor beneath us had just cracked wide open. For a long, terrifying heartbeat, I thought she would scream. I thought she'd call the guards back and have me thrown in the deepest dungeon they had. Instead, I felt the cloth over my eyes begin to loosen. A hand, small and trembling, was working at the knot behind my head. Her fingers brushed against my neck, and a shiver went right down my spine. The blindfold slid free, and the darkness I'd been carrying for what felt like an eternity finally shattered. Light hit me so hard I flinched, but it wasn't the sun that blinded me. It was her. The world sharpened all at once as the cloth fell away. I sucked in a breath like a man who'd been held underwater for too long. At first, all I could see was the light, flooding through huge jeweled windows, scattering a rainbow of colors across the cold stone walls. But then my eyes focused, and then there was only her. She stood so close I could see the tiny tremor in her hands as she clutched the discarded blindfold. Her fingers were wrapped around it like it was a guilty secret she couldn't let go of. The whispers in the town, the stories the nobles told each other, they were all lies. They spoke of a cursed princess, a monster whose beauty could drive men to madness. But the face in front of me wasn't a curse. It was the loneliest truth I had ever seen. Her eyes, dark and deep and filled with storms she'd never been allowed to unleash, met mine. And for a moment that stretched into 1,000 years, neither of us moved. My breath was ragged in my chest, but I refused to look away. I couldn't. Terror was chewing on my insides, telling me I was a dead man, but I didn't care, because this was no monster. This was a woman who was begging, without words, to just be seen, to be more than the hushed whispers of her title. She shivered, a tiny, violent movement, as if every second of eye contact was tearing another rule, another lie, right off her skin. "No one," she whispered, and her voice broke on the words. "No one has ever dared." Her lips trembled, and she quickly dropped her gaze to the floor, as though she was ashamed of the very gift she had just given me. I wanted to tell her she had nothing to be afraid of, not from me. But the words died in my throat, because in that exact moment, the chamber doors didn't just open. They slammed wide, crashing against the stone walls with a sound like thunder. 3 guards, their faces grim, strode into the room. My whole body seized up. My heart was a wild horse galloping in my chest, trying to break free. But she just lifted her chin. All the trembling was gone. In its place was a core of pure steel I never would have expected. She barked an order, her voice so sharp it could have cut stone. "Leave us!" The guards froze solid, their hands on the hilts of their swords. Confusion rippled between them like a heat wave. It was so clear, so obvious, that they had never heard her speak with such command. Not ever. Still, after a tense moment, they bowed. A grudging, shallow bow, simmering with suspicion. They backed out of the room, pulling the heavy doors shut behind them. But I knew. I knew their ears were pressed against the wood, listening to the silence on the other side. My knees ached from kneeling on the cold floor, but I didn't get up. I couldn't. I had already broken the kingdom's most sacred law just by looking at her. And still, my eyes refused to let her go. She saw it. She saw the way I couldn't stop staring, and a faint blush, fragile but fierce, lit up her cheeks. Then, in a whisper so faint I almost missed it, she asked the one question no royal should ever have to confess. "Do you think I am cursed?" The question hollowed me out, because I understood it all in that instant. The curse wasn't in her. It was the lie. The lie the whole world had tied around her throat like a noose, just to keep her hidden, to keep her powerless. I shook my head, slowly, my own voice scraping its way out of my tight throat. "You're not cursed," I said. "You're human." For the very first time, her lips parted in something that was almost a smile. It was a sad, broken thing, draped in sorrow like a veil, but it was there. She leaned closer, so close her shadow fell over me, and she whispered words meant only for me, words that sounded like a prophecy. "Then keep seeing me," she breathed, "before they take you away." The echo of her words rattled through my bones long after she pulled back. "Keep seeing me before they take you away." It wasn't just a plea, it was a warning. The silence in that huge chamber grew thick again, heavy, broken only by the faint, hungry hiss of the torches burning in their sconces along the walls. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes. Even with the guards gone, I knew that beyond those giant carved doors, whispers were already slithering down the stone corridors like snakes. A ranch hand had looked at the princess. I had looked at the one thing no man was allowed to look at, and sooner or later someone was going to come to collect the price for that crime. The princess, though, she didn't flinch. She turned away from me and seemed to float towards the tall, arched windows at the far end of the room. The blindfold was still clutched in her hand, a pale, limp thing like a dying bird. She lifted her face towards the slice of night sky framed by the colored glass, and I realized she was breathing like she was doing it for the first time in her life. Deep, shuddering breaths. "All my life," she said, her voice soft, but it carried in the still air. "I have been told that my face would ruin kingdoms, that my eyes would bring destruction to any man who dared to meet them. So they hid me. They hid me in shadows and taught me to be ashamed of my own reflection. Do you know what it is to live your entire life unseen?" I swallowed, the lump in my throat hard as a rock. "I do now," I said, my voice low but steady. She glanced back over her shoulder, and a flicker of surprise lit up her dark eyes. In that look, I saw the smallest crack appear in the fortress of her loneliness. But just as quickly, it was gone. Her jaw hardened, her expression turning grim. "You will be punished for this," she whispered, and it sounded like she was testing the words, seeing how much truth her own lips could bear to speak. Before I could think of an answer, a new sound came from outside the door. A rustle that grew into the sound of angry voices, the heavy, determined tread of booted feet on stone. A lot of them. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. They were coming back. She spun around, her eyes wide with alarm, and she grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. For a moment I could feel the wild, terrified tremor of her pulse beating against my own wrist. "Promise me," she said, her voice urgent, her eyes flashing in the torchlight. "Promise me you won't look away. No matter what they say, no matter what they threaten to do." Fear, sharp and cold, was clawing its way up my ribs, trying to choke me. But looking into her eyes, seeing the desperation and the flicker of fight there, I knew I had no choice. I gave her a single, firm nod. "I promise." The doors didn't just open, they exploded inward. 5 men stormed into the chamber. The three guards from before, a priest draped in stark white robes, and a tall, imposing figure cloaked in black from head to toe. A silver seal like a spider was pinned to his chest. Authority radiated from him like a killing frost. His gaze fell on me, still kneeling at the princess's feet, and his lip curled back in a sneer of pure disgust. "So it's true," he hissed, his voice like the scrape of steel on stone. "The outlaw dares to break the sacred decree." The princess stepped in front of me, a human shield in silk and sorrow. She held her chin high, and though her voice trembled, it was loud and clear. "He has done nothing wrong. I let him see me." That one sentence sent a visible chill down the hall. It was as if the stone walls themselves had gasped in shock. The cloaked man's eyes narrowed, rage burning in their depths like hot coals. "Then you have cursed us both," he spat before lifting his hand in a sharp, brutal signal. Steel flashed. The guards drew their blades in a single fluid motion. And for the first time, I truly felt the crushing weight of her secret, her cage, pressing down not just on her shoulders, but on mine as well. The guards surged forward. They moved like wolves that had been starved for a week and just been shown a meal. Their blades glinted hungrily in the torchlight. But just as they were about to reach me, the princess lifted her hand. A single sharp gesture. It stopped them dead in their tracks. Her eyes were locked on the cloaked man's face, steady and completely unflinching. "Enough," she said, and her voice rang against the stone walls, sharp and clear and final. For the first time I heard real command in her tone. Not the timid whisper of a hidden girl. This was the voice of someone who was born to rule, someone who had just remembered it. The cloaked man stiffened, but he didn't lower his hand. "You dare break the vow your own father swore?" he snarled, a fleck of spittle shining on his lip in the firelight. "The veil was your covenant with the gods. You show your face, and kingdoms fall. It is written." The princess took a slow, deep breath, and I realized she was trembling again, but this time it wasn't with fear. It was with a fury that had been simmering for a lifetime. "It wasn't my father's vow," she said, her voice low and dangerous. She lifted the blindfold, the silk scarf, high into the air for all of them to see. "It was yours!" Her words hit him like a physical blow. The priest gasped. The guards shifted on their feet. "You have kept me a prisoner in my own home," she continued, her voice rising with every word. "You have used my face as a threat to guard your own power. And now, the very first man who has ever seen me with eyes unclouded by your lies calls me human. Not a curse." She turned her gaze to me just for a second, and in that moment, I understood what this cloaked figure feared more than anything else in the world. It wasn't her beauty. It wasn't a curse. It was the simple, terrifying possibility that she might one day be loved, that someone might see the woman, not the weapon he had made her out to be. "You don't understand what you've done," the cloaked man hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. "If she belongs to you, she no longer belongs to us. Do you know what you've taken, outlaw?" I stared right back at him, a hot fire rising in my own blood. I got to my feet slowly, unsteadily. "I didn't take anything," I said, my voice rough. "She gave me something you never could, the truth." His hand snapped down like the fall of a guillotine. It was the signal. The guards lunged again, steel screaming as it was drawn from their scabbards. The princess cried out my name, but before their blades could find me, something happened that no one in that room could have ever expected. A horn sounded in the distance, a deep, mournful, powerful sound that echoed through the stone halls of the palace. The guards froze again, their faces going pale under their helmets. The cloaked man's eyes widened, first in confusion, then in pure, unadulterated disbelief. "No," he breathed, the words stolen from his lungs. The princess straightened up, her hand gripping my sleeve so tightly her knuckles were white. "What is it?" I whispered, my own heart hammering against my ribs. She turned her face toward the direction of the sound, and for the very first time since I'd met her, I saw something that looked like hope stir in her dark eyes. "That horn," she said softly, almost to herself. "That horn is only ever blown when the people gather outside the palace gates." She looked at the cloaked man, a challenge in her gaze. "If they've come now," she said, her voice growing stronger. They must have heard. The cloaked man's face, what I could see of it in the shadows of his hood, twisted with a new kind of rage, a rage born of fear. His authority, so absolute just moments before, was suddenly shaken. He shoved the white-robed priest aside and bellowed at the guards, his voice cracking. "Seal the gates! Do not let them near her!" But the horn blew again, closer this time, and with it, a new sound, the rising murmur of hundreds of voices, carried on the night wind. The princess leaned closer to me, her breath trembling against my ear. "They've never dared to come for me before," she whispered, a sense of awe in her voice. "Now they will see what you have seen." The horn's call didn't fade. It multiplied. A second horn answered the first, then a third, until the night was filled with their deep, resonant call. By the time the echo of the last blast had settled over the palace, the sound of voices from outside the stone walls was no longer a murmur. It was a roar. Dozens had turned into hundreds, hundreds into what sounded like thousands. The sound carried like a rising tide, swelling with words I couldn't quite make out, but the intent was clear. The princess's hand tightened around my arm, her knuckles bone white. "They know," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "Somehow, they know." The cloaked man's face was a mask of fury, cracking under the pressure of a fear he had never expected to feel. "Keep her hidden!" he roared at the guards, but the men were hesitating now. Their eyes kept shifting uneasily toward the great doors, toward the growing noise that was pressing in from the outside world. For years, they had obeyed his every command without question, but fear of the people was an old and powerful thing, not so easily silenced. I leaned closer to the princess, my own heart pounding with a wild, dangerous hope. "Do you want them to see you?" I whispered quickly. Her eyes, brighter than any fire in that moment, never left the heavy doors. "All my life, I have been unseen," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Tonight, let me be known." Before the cloaked man could react, before he could scream another order, she pulled me with her. We ran, not away from the doors, but towards the grand archway that led out into the main courtyard. The guards took a step forward to block us, but they hesitated again as a new sound began. Pounding. First, it was fists, a frantic, desperate rhythm against the thick wood of the gates. Then came the thud of sticks, of hammers, of the butts of farming tools and old spears. The massive gates shook on their iron hinges, and then a chant rose up, cutting through the clamor. Her name, over and over, they were chanting her name. She froze mid-step, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if the very sound of her own name on their lips was a miracle she couldn't comprehend. "They remember me," she breathed. The cloaked man spat on the marble floor, his hand rising as if he meant to strike her down right there. But I moved faster. I stepped between them, my whole body tight with a rage I didn't know I possessed. "Touch her," I growled, the rawness in my own voice surprising me, "and I'll tear that cloak from your head myself." For a single silent heartbeat, the world hung suspended. Then the gates gave way, not with a crack, but with a roar. They burst open, torn from their hinges by the sheer force of the crowd. A sea of lanterns and torches flooded into the courtyard, bobbing in the night like angry fireflies. It was a sea of villagers, of farmers, of mothers and fathers and children, pouring into the sanctum of power. They carried torches, yes, but they also carried bread loaves and freshly cut branches and broken tools, symbols of both their defiance and their hope. At the very front of the crowd, an old woman with a face like a roadmap of hardship lifted her voice. "We have come for the daughter you hid from us!" she cried, her voice rough as gravel but strong as iron. The crowd echoed her words, a single, unified roar, and they surged forward until the line of guards completely faltered, their discipline shattered. The princess's breath caught in her throat. The blindfold, the silk veil, was still clutched in her hand. In the wild torchlight, it fluttered like a pale ghost. She turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "If I step forward now," she whispered, "they will never let me step back into the shadows." My chest burned as I looked at her. This woman who had lived her entire life as a ghost, This woman who had asked me, a stranger, to be the first to look upon her face. Then step, I whispered back, my voice thick, and I'll step right beside you. She drew in a long, shuddering breath, a breath that seemed to pull in all the courage in the world. She let the blindfold, that symbol of her prison, fall from her fingers onto the cold stones, and she walked forward, into the light of 1,000 torches. The crowd hushed as one. Their roar died in their throats, their torches lowered as if their arms had suddenly grown heavy. And for the very first time in her life, the people of the kingdom looked at their princess. The hush of the crowd was fragile, delicate, like a sheet of thin glass, just waiting for a stone to be thrown, and the cloaked man was the one to throw it. He strode forward, his black robes a slash of darkness against the brilliant torchlight, his arm raised high as if he held judgment itself in his hand. "Do not be fooled," he thundered, his voice booming off the stone walls of the courtyard. "She is no princess. She is the curse that brought famine to your fields, the storm that ruined your harvests, the sickness that took your children in the night." His words were poison. They slithered through the air like invisible smoke, coiling around the old fears the people had been fed their entire lives. You could see it on their faces. The hope that had been there just a moment before began to shift, to curdle into uncertainty. Eyes darted from her unveiled face to his accusing finger, and back again. The princess stood perfectly still, a lone island in a sea of doubt. Though I could see her hands, clenched into tight fists at her sides, were trembling. I felt the weight of that moment, of all those years of lies, pressing down on her, threatening to crush her, to drag her right back into the shadows he had built for her. I stepped closer, so my shoulder was almost touching hers, and I spoke low, the words meant only for her ears. "He speaks lies," I murmured, "but they believe those lies because no one has ever shown them the truth. Show them now." Her lips parted as if she couldn't get enough air, but then her gaze swept over the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one. She lifted her chin, and the last of the veil fell completely from her hands, forgotten on the stones. "You were told I was a curse!" she called out, her voice thin at first, but it grew steadily stronger with each word. "But tell me, was it my face that raised your taxes until you starved? Was it my hands that burned your homes when you could not pay? Did my eyes spill the blood of your brothers in the streets for daring to speak out? Or were those things done by the very ones who told you I was to blame?" A murmur broke through the crowd. Uneasy at first, but it grew louder, angrier, as if the question was a key that was unlocking 100 other questions they had never dared to ask aloud before. The cloaked man snarled, his voice rising like the crack of a whip. "Do not listen to her! Her beauty is a trap! Her eyes are a spell! Avert your gaze or she will bind you all to ruin!" But even as he shouted his desperate warnings, I saw heads turning. I saw eyes locking on her face, really seeing her for the first time. And the longer they looked, the more their fear seemed to melt away, replaced by something far more dangerous to his power. Hope. A child's voice, small and high and completely unafraid, cut through the muttering. "She looks like Mama," a little girl whispered, clutching her father's hand. Those 4 simple words spread through the crowd faster and more powerfully than any of the cloaked man's shouts ever could. The father stared at the princess for a long moment. Then he bent down, lifted his daughter high onto his shoulders, and let her stare openly, freely. "Then let her be seen," the father said, his voice firm and clear. It was like a dam breaking. The crowd roared, the sound rolling through the courtyard like thunder, so loud it completely drowned out the cloaked man's furious denials. He spun toward the handful of guards who were still loyal to him. "Stop them! Blindfold her! Now!" But the men hesitated. Their swords hung slack at their sides, their faces torn between a lifetime of command and the undeniable truth they were seeing with their own eyes. The princess reached out and took my hand, her grip no longer trembling, but firm and strong. "They're choosing," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. And I knew, in that moment, that if the people's choice held, the lie that had bound her for so many years was about to snap like a rotten piece of twine caught in a hurricane. The air itself seemed to burn with the sound of voices finally breaking free. 1,000 throats, shouting her name not as a chant of legend, but as a cheer of liberation, as if chains they hadn't even realized they were wearing had just cracked and fallen away. The princess stood taller, her hand still clutching mine, her face glowing in the torchlight with a kind of strength that no command could ever silence again. For a heartbeat, the cloaked man looked cornered, trapped, his dark robe shifting around him like a shadow with nowhere left to hide. And then he smiled. It was a twisted, venomous curl of his lips that chilled me more than all his rage ever had. From the deep folds beneath his cloak, he drew not a sword, but a small, golden vial. Its glass was etched with strange, spidery markings I didn't recognize. He held it high so the entire crowd could see it glinting in the firelight. "You think she is freedom!" he shouted, his voice riding above the thunder of the people. "You think she is hope!" He let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Then watch what she truly brings." He uncorked the vial with a flick of his thumb, and with a vicious movement flung the contents into the large fire pit that burned at the center of the square. The flames, which had been a warm and welcoming orange, instantly surged. They roared skyward, spitting and hissing, and turned a sickening, unnatural green. A foul smoke, thick and oily, curled outward from the blaze, choking the air. Panic struck the crowd like a physical hammer blow. Men grabbed their children, pulling them close. Women cried out, covering their mouths with their hands. The cheers of hope turned into ragged coughs and choked cries of terror. The cloaked man pointed a long, accusing finger at her, his voice ringing with triumph. "See, her very presence poisons the air! Look how the sacred fire itself bows to her curse!" The crowd staggered back, fear clawing its way back into their hearts, threatening to undo everything. I pulled her close, trying to shield her with my own body as the acrid, biting smoke swirled around us. "It's a trick!" I growled, forcing my voice to be loud and steady, praying the people could hear me over their own panicked gasps. "It's a trick of his hand, not hers." But doubt, once planted, is a stubborn weed. I could see it flickering in their eyes again. Old wounds, old fears, reopening in their minds. The cloaked man stepped forward, raising his arms wide like some dark prophet of doom. "Bow to me or choke on her curse!" he screamed. "I am the shield that stands between you and her ruin." He spread his cloak wide, and from its dark folds, soldiers spilled out. Men in black iron armor who had been hidden in the shadows until this very moment. Their swords flashed as they formed a perfect, menacing circle around the crowd, forcing them back, forcing them into silence with the cold hiss of steel. My heart pounded with a helpless, boiling rage, but the princess's voice cut right through my fury. "Let me speak," she whispered, her hand tightening around mine until I thought my bones would crack. "If I do not speak now, his lie will take root and never be torn out again." She stepped forward, away from the shelter of my body, even as the green smoke coiled around her like a living thing and the circle of soldiers closed in. She raised her voice, and it was not the voice of a girl or a princess, but of a queen. "No curse lives in me!" she cried, her voice ringing out louder and clearer than the crackle of the poisoned fire. "But one lives in the hearts of those who profit from your fear." Her words struck the crowd like a stone thrown into a still pond, ripples of thought pushing outward against the tide of panic. A few villagers straightened their backs. A few fists clenched at their sides. A few pairs of eyes turned from her and fixed on the cloaked man, a new, hard suspicion dawning in them. He saw it. He saw the shift. And for the very first time, his triumphant smile faltered. The battle for their belief was not over, but the tide was shifting again, dangerously, desperately, and the long night was far from done. The crowd was a trapped animal, caught between two powerful forces, the regent's terror pushing them back and her courage pulling them forward. The soldiers in their black iron armor moved like a pack of wolves, their blades glinting under the sickly green fire, slowly tightening their circle as if the people were already their prey. The regent, the cloaked man, raised his hand again, and the foul smoke seemed to swell on his command, hissing with a sound that felt horribly alive. "Bow!" he commanded, his voice now low, but sharp enough to slice right through the chaos. Bow to your regent, and I will spare you from the blight she carries. But something shifted in the air, something he hadn't planned for. An old man near the front, his back bent and twisted by years of hard labor, suddenly threw his walking stick. It clattered into the green fire, and for a moment the flames sputtered. I bow to no man's fear! The old man shouted, his voice a ragged cough through the thick smoke. His defiance was a single tiny spark, but it was enough. A woman near him followed, stepping forward to shield her child's eyes not from the princess, but from the regent. She dared to look at the princess, a silent act of trust. Then another villager, and another. Small, individual sparks of courage, but together they began to push back the darkness. The smoke seemed to falter, to thin, as if it were fed by their fear and starved by their bravery. The regent saw it, and real panic, stark and ugly, began to creep into his face. He grabbed one of his own soldiers by the arm, dragging him into the firelight. Strike her! He screamed, his voice a frantic shriek. End this illusion! End this hope before it spreads! The soldier, a young man, hesitated. Sweat beaded on his brow beneath his heavy helmet. His sword trembled in his hand as he looked at the princess. The green smoke swirled around her, making her seem ethereal, almost a ghost, but her eyes were calm and unflinching. She raised her hand, not in a gesture to stop him, but as if to offer it. You were taught to fear me, she said, her voice impossibly soft, yet it carried through the sudden stillness of the square. But I am only a woman, like the mothers who raised you, like the daughters you protect. Do not let him blind you with his lies any longer. The soldier's sword didn't swing. It fell. It dropped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the stone ground, the sound ringing out loud and final in the silence. A collective gasp rippled across the square. The regent roared in pure fury. He shoved the disobedient soldier aside so hard the man stumbled and fell. He lifted his golden vial again, the last of his poison. Then choke with her! He bellowed, and with a final desperate howl of rage he hurled the last of the liquid into the fire. The flames howled. They flared so high they painted the entire sky a venomous green. But this time, something was different. This time, instead of spreading fear, the blaze seemed to bend back upon itself. The smoke didn't spread outward. It twisted, it curled inward, wrapping around the regent's black cloak as if his own poison had finally turned traitor. He staggered backward, clawing at the air, his hood falling away to reveal a face contorted with a terror he had always inflicted but never felt. The villagers watched, their expressions a mix of awe and dread, as the man who had ruled their fears for so many years began to choke on his own dark creation. His grip on this kingdom wasn't broken yet. His soldiers still tightened their circle, and though the crowd was stirring with a newfound courage, the final clash had not yet erupted. The fire may have betrayed him, but the night still demanded blood before it would release its hold. The fire coiled tighter and tighter around the regent, the green smoke hissing like a nest of angry serpents. But he fought against it, a cornered rat, clawing his way towards the princess as if he could drag his own shadow with him. She is the curse! He shrieked, his voice cracking, his face half blackened by the smoke. Blind yourselves or you will all be destroyed! But no one turned away this time. The old man who had thrown his stick into the fire raised his voice again, shouting a new command that caught like a spark in dry grass. Look at her! He cried, and the cry was picked up by another, and another, until the whole square was chanting it. Look at her! Look at her! One by one, every villager who had been bowed and broken by fear lifted their heads. Their eyes, all of them, fixed not on the swirling green smoke, but on her. The soldiers faltered. Their perfect circle of steel began to break, because they too were looking, and they could not look at her and still believe she was a monster. The princess reached up slowly, her hand trembling but her movement steady with an iron resolve, and she pulled the last traces of the veil from her face, letting it fall away completely. The square fell silent. She was not a curse. She was not a shadow. She was a woman, with eyes so full of a lifetime of sorrow and a moment of incredible courage that no magical fire could ever hope to conceal it. Tears ran freely down her cheeks, shining like diamonds against the green blaze, and in that moment, the crowd saw it. They saw the truth. She hadn't been hidden away because of a curse. She had been hidden away to keep her power, the power of their love for her, from ever undoing the lies of a tyrant. The regent lunged, a last desperate attempt to cover her face again, to plunge the world back into his darkness. But the young soldier who had dropped his sword moved first. He slammed his armored body into the regent, bringing him crashing to the ground. The golden vial, the one he had clutched so tightly, flew from his hands and shattered against the stones near the fire. The green smoke shrieked, a high, thin sound like something dying, and then it curled into nothing, burning itself out in a final pathetic puff. Silence. A profound, ringing silence followed, broken only by the ragged, relieved breathing of those who had stood frozen in fear for far too long. Slowly, one by one, the villagers knelt, not in fear this time, but in reverence. Their heads bowed toward her as one. The young soldier pressed a mailed fist to his chest, a silent pledge of loyalty, and the other soldiers, seeing their commander defeated and the truth revealed, followed his lead. The regent struggled once more, spitting curses and threats from the ground. But his own fire had caught the edges of his cloak, and as the soldiers dragged him away, powerless and defeated, his voice was lost to the rising smoke and ash. The princess lowered her gaze, the last piece of her veil still clutched in her hand. Then she turned to me. For my whole life, I'd been a boy who followed rules, who did what he was told. I had obeyed their law, never daring to lift my eyes. But now, she whispered my name, and then she said, "Look at me." And I did. She was not the perfect, flawless beauty of the stories. Her face was scarred, not by any curse, but by the cruelty of her confinement, by years spent in darkness. But none of it mattered. What shone from her was not perfection, but the profound grace of finally being seen, truly and completely, exactly as she was. The villagers watched as she placed her hand over mine, the blue silk scarf, the blindfold, resting between our palms. "No one was allowed to look at me," she said softly, her voice carrying through the hushed night. "But you did, and you stayed." I bowed my head, not in fear, not as a servant, but in a silent promise. Because I knew in that moment that I was not her property, not her purchase, but her choice. And as the first light of dawn began to break over the rooftops, the people rose with us, free at last. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of courage and truth. And let us know in the comments. If you had been told never to look, would you have obeyed the rule, or would you have dared to see the truth for yourself?